You've wasted years of my life, Graham!
I never lied to you. Everything is ready, sir.
That's not possible.
If he's inside that building, we've been wrong.
Why didn't you tell me who you really are?
You never asked the right questions.
Victoria Collins wanted the whole neighborhood to watch when she threw Graham Sterling's clothes across the driveway. To her, he was a broke, unambitious husband who had wasted years of her life. Graham stood beside an open suitcase without defending himself. Then 10 black SUVs turned onto the quiet street. Men in tailored suits stepped out and walked directly toward him. Victoria expected confusion. Instead, the first man lowered his head with respect, and Graham remained painfully calm. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 years earlier, their marriage had still felt safe. Graham and Victoria lived in a modest house outside Charlotte, North Carolina. It had 3 bedrooms, a narrow porch, and a driveway cracked by years of heat and rain. Victoria had once called it charming. Lately, she called it temporary. Graham drove an older pickup truck and wore the same dark jackets until the sleeves softened. He told Victoria that he worked in private investment consulting. The explanation was true, but incomplete. His schedule shifted without warning. Some weeks he worked from a small office downtown. Other weeks he flew to New York, London, or Singapore and returned without stories about expensive hotels or important meetings. Victoria assumed the travel meant unstable contract work. She had never seen Graham worried about bills, but she had also never seen him display wealth. Their mortgage was paid automatically. Repairs were handled without arguments. When Robert Collins needed help covering medical expenses after surgery, Graham quietly arranged the money through what he described as an emergency fund. Victoria accepted the help without asking where it came from. That was how their marriage worked. Graham handled problems quietly. Victoria enjoyed the results while resenting the lack of visible success behind them. He had hidden the full truth before their wedding, not through a false name or invented career, but through layers of privacy that were common in his world. His controlling interests were held through private companies, family trusts, and investment entities that rarely placed his face in public reports. He had spent years avoiding interviews and allowing senior executives to represent the businesses he influenced. Graham had seen what money did to people. Old friendships had turned into requests. Romantic interest had become calculation. By the time he met Victoria, he wanted one relationship in which his value did not arrive with a balance sheet attached. At first, she made him believe he had found it. But lately, Victoria watched other people's lives too closely. Her friends posted photographs from luxury resorts. Their husbands leased European cars and wore watches designed to be noticed. At dinners, Victoria laughed along when someone joked that Graham dressed like a maintenance supervisor. Graham heard the jokes. He simply did not react. That restraint began to anger her. "You never care how we look," she told him one evening. They were seated across from each other at the kitchen table. Graham had prepared dinner after Victoria came home late from a networking event. Her food remained untouched. "I care how we live," he said. "That's not the same thing." Graham studied her face. She was not asking for security. They already had that. She wanted proof other people could see. His phone vibrated beside his plate. The screen displayed a short message from Margaret Lawson. The directors had moved the vote forward. His authorization would be required within the week. Graham turned the phone face down. Victoria noticed. "Another client? Something I need to handle." She gave a tired laugh. "There is always something you need to handle, but somehow nothing changes." Graham could have corrected her. He could have opened the confidential report waiting in his email. He could have shown her the acquisition figures, the voting structure, and the names of executives who would not move without his approval. But revelation demanded trust, and trust had been thinning inside their home for months. He stayed because he still remembered the woman who had once sat with him on that same porch during a thunderstorm, happy with takeout food and no audience. He wanted to believe that woman was still there. The next morning, Victoria left for work without touching the coffee he made for her. Graham remained in the kitchen after the front door closed. His phone rang again. This time, he answered. Thomas Reed's voice came through, calm and professional. The security schedule has been finalized. 10 vehicles will be available on Thursday. Ms. Lawson also needs your decision before the board convenes. Graham looked toward the empty doorway. Thursday was the same day Victoria had demanded they discuss the future of their marriage. Keep the schedule, Graham said. There was a brief pause. Understood, sir. Graham ended the call just as Victoria returned unexpectedly for the folder she had forgotten. She stood in the hallway, staring at him. For the first time, she had heard someone speak to her supposedly unsuccessful husband as though his answer could move an entire organization. Victoria remained in the hallway with one hand resting on the forgotten folder. Her eyes stayed on Graham's phone. Who was that? Graham slipped the device into his pocket. Someone coordinating travel. He called you, sir. He's formal. The answer was true, but it satisfied nothing. Victoria stepped into the kitchen and studied him, as if she had found a crack in a wall she had stopped noticing years ago. 10 vehicles, she asked. What kind of consulting job needs 10 vehicles? It's connected to a meeting. That doesn't answer the question. Graham held her gaze. He could have told her more. He could have explained that Thomas Reed had coordinated security for executives, diplomats, and private investors whose decisions affected markets. He could have said the vehicles were not a luxury request, but part of a risk protocol required by company councils. Instead, he asked, "Aren't you going to be late?" Victoria's face tightened. She took the folder from the counter. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Make me feel unreasonable for asking basic questions." Graham did not answer. She left before the argument could grow, closing the door harder than necessary. For most of their marriage, Victoria had accepted Graham's privacy because it came wrapped in stability. Their bills were never late. The roof had been replaced without debt. When her father, Robert Collins, needed rehabilitation after a heart procedure, Graham had quietly covered the portion insurance did not. He never asked Robert to repay him. Robert had thanked Victoria instead. She never corrected him. Graham had not minded then. He believed kindness lost some of its meaning when it demanded recognition. But over time, his silence had created space for a different story. In Victoria's version, she was the ambitious one. She maintained professional relationships, attended industry events, and pushed for a more visible life. Graham merely kept them comfortable enough to survive. She did not understand that comfort had been a choice. Years before he met her, Graham had lived inside a world where every introduction came with an estimate of his value. His name had once appeared beside investment deals, technology acquisitions, and private infrastructure projects. He had learned quickly that attention attracted the wrong kind of loyalty. An old friend had sold private conversations to a business reporter. A woman he dated had forwarded confidential travel information to her brother, hoping it would help him secure a contract. Even relatives he barely knew had arrived with proposals disguised as emergencies. Graham had not withdrawn from business. He had withdrawn from visibility. With advice from attorneys and tax professionals, his ownership interests had been organized through private holding companies, family trusts, and limited partnerships. Senior executives handled public appearances. His voting rights remained protected, but his name rarely appeared in places an ordinary internet search would reach. He had told Victoria before their wedding that much of his work was confidential. She had laughed and said she preferred a man who did not brag. At the time, he believed her. Their first apartment had been small enough that they could hear the refrigerator hum from the bedroom. Victoria had worked long hours building contacts in commercial design. Graham had traveled often, but when he was home, he cooked, repaired what broke, and listened while she talked through difficult clients. She had once loved that he was steady. Then her social circle changed. Victoria began working with developers whose lives were displayed through private clubs, imported cars, and vacation homes. Dinner conversations became quiet competitions. People compared neighborhoods, watches, renovations, and memberships as if affection could be measured by access. At first, Victoria mocked them when she came home. Soon she began studying them. She replaced practical furniture with pieces chosen for appearance. She criticized Graham's truck even though it ran perfectly. She started asking why they lived outside the city, when other couples she knew had moved into gated communities. Graham listened and offered compromises. They could renovate the kitchen. They could travel more often. They could look at another house if she truly wanted one. But he would not turn their life into a performance. That refusal became, in Victoria's mind, evidence that he could not afford the life she wanted. By Thursday morning, the tension had settled into every room. Victoria stood in front of the bedroom mirror, fastening earrings Graham had given her on their 5th anniversary. They were understated and valuable, chosen by a private jeweler who never advertised his clients. Victoria wore them often without knowing what they had cost. "My mother invited us to dinner Saturday," she said. Graham folded a shirt and placed it into a travel bag. "I'll be back by then." She asked what you actually do. He glanced at her reflection. "What did you tell her?" "That you consult. That's accurate." Victoria turned. "It sounds vague because it is vague. My work has confidentiality requirements." "Convenient." Graham stopped packing. "I've never asked you to lie for me. You don't have to. You give me nothing specific enough to tell anyone." He closed the bag calmly. "Our marriage shouldn't need a job title to make sense to other people. That's easy to say when you're not the one being judged." The words landed harder than she realized. Graham had spent years being judged for having too much. Victoria resented him because she believed he had too little. His phone lit up on the dresser. A secure email from Margaret Lawson confirmed that the acquisition documents were complete. Final authorization would remain pending until Graham appeared before the board. He read the message, then locked the screen. Victoria watched him. "What are you hiding?" Graham placed the phone in his jacket. "Something I'm not permitted to discuss yet." She gave a bitter smile. "There's always an..." He lifted his travel bag. "We'll talk tonight. No, tonight. We're deciding whether this marriage is going anywhere." For the first time, Graham did not reassure her. "We can decide that," he said. "But we're going to do it respectfully." Victoria looked surprised by the boundary in his voice. Graham left for the meeting he had described only as consulting work. Victoria remained beside the window, watching his old truck disappear down the street. That afternoon, she attended a private networking reception at a downtown hotel. She had nearly canceled, but being surrounded by successful people felt easier than returning home to unanswered questions. Near the bar, a man in an expensive Navy suit was telling a group of executives about a waterfront development he claimed would reshape half the city. His name was Blake Harrison. When he noticed Victoria listening, he smiled as though he already knew exactly what she wanted to hear. Blake Harrison did not ask what Victoria did for a living. He asked where she planned to go next. That alone caught her attention. Most people at the reception were busy describing what they had already achieved. Blake spoke as if everything important was still ahead. He leaned casually against the bar, a glass in his hand, confidence resting in his posture rather than his voice. "You look like someone who's outgrown her current situation," he said. Victoria smiled politely at first. "That's a bold assumption. I work in development," Blake replied. "You learn to read structure, building, markets, people. And what do you see? Potential. Wasted if you stay where you are." The words landed with more precision than she expected. He had never met Graham. He had no idea what her marriage looked like. And yet somehow his statement felt accurate to the version of reality she had been building in her head. They spoke longer than she intended. Blake described projects across multiple states, waterfront expansions, mixed-use properties, private investors who expected returns, not excuses. He spoke about numbers without hesitation. Millions flowed through his sentences as if they were ordinary. Victoria listened, absorbing more than she admitted. When she mentioned her husband, she simplified the truth. "He does consulting," she said. Blake nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Stable but limited. Victoria did not correct him. That silence mattered more than anything she said. Later that night, she returned home to find Graham already there. His travel bag sat near the door. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. He looked up from the kitchen table. "How was the event?" "Productive." She placed her purse down and walked past him without stopping. Something in her posture had shifted. It was subtle, but Graham noticed. He always noticed. "Did you meet anyone interesting?" he asked. Victoria paused. For a moment she considered telling the truth. Then she chose something easier, just people who know where they're going. Graham leaned back slightly. "And we don't?" Victoria turned to face him. "Do we?" The question hung between them, heavier than it sounded. Graham did not answer immediately. He had spent years making decisions that shaped companies, investments, and entire markets. Yet inside his own home, he was being measured by what he chose not to display. "I thought we were building something stable," he said. "Stable isn't the same as successful. It depends on what you value." Victoria crossed her arms. "I value progress. And you think we don't have that?" "I think we're standing still while everyone else moves forward." Graham studied her face again. This time he saw something clearer. It was not just frustration, it was comparison. And comparison had a way of distorting everything it touched. His phone vibrated on the table. Another message from Margaret Lawson. The board had advanced the timeline again. Final confirmation would now be required within days, not weeks. The acquisition could not proceed without his direct approval. Graham glanced at the message, then locked the screen. Victoria noticed the movement. "Another secret?" she asked. "It's work, you always say that." "Because it is." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what I think?" "I think you hide behind vague answers, because there's nothing concrete to show." Graham felt the words settle deeper than she intended. Not because they were true, but because they revealed how little she understood the life he had chosen to keep separate from this house. "I don't need to prove anything," he said quietly. "That's exactly the problem." Silence followed. Victoria turned away first. She walked upstairs, leaving the conversation unfinished. Graham remained at the table for a long time. He did not chase her. He did not raise his voice, but something shifted inside him, not anger, not even disappointment. Something closer to clarity. Respect had started to disappear, and once respect leaves a relationship, everything else follows. The next few days moved faster. Victoria accepted another invitation from Blake. This time, it was not a crowded networking event. It was a private dinner with investors. The restaurant was downtown, discreet and expensive, the kind of place where reservations were not requested but arranged. Blake greeted her like she already belonged there. "You made the right decision coming tonight," he said. "What decision?" "To step into a room that reflects your potential." Victoria sat beside him, aware of the difference immediately. The conversations were sharper, the expectations higher. People spoke about expansion, acquisitions, and leverage without hesitation. No one spoke about stability. Blake introduced her as someone positioned for more. The phrase stayed with her long after the dinner ended. On the drive home, she did not think about Graham as her partner. She thought about him as her limitation. Meanwhile, Graham sat in his office downtown, reviewing documents most people would never see. Legal structures, ownership layers, voting rights attached to entities that did not carry his name. Thomas Reed had sent a revised security schedule. 10 vehicles confirmed, routes mapped, arrival times adjusted to match the board meeting. Graham read through the details carefully. Not because he doubted them, but because control meant understanding every moving piece. He signed off on the arrangements. Then he opened another file, a draft prepared by legal counsel. It was not a business document. It was a contingency. If the marriage dissolved, the asset separation would remain clean. The structure ensured that nothing tied to his primary holdings would be exposed or contested. It was not about hiding wealth. It was about protecting it from becoming leverage in a situation driven by emotion. Graham closed the file. He did not want to use it, but for the first time he understood that he might have to. His phone buzzed again. A message from Victoria. "I won't be home tonight. Don't wait up." Graham stared at the screen. Then he placed the phone down and made a decision he had been avoiding. He reached for another number, someone who did not ask unnecessary questions. When the call connected, his voice was calm. "I need you to prepare everything," he said. A pause, then a simple response. "Understood, sir." Graham ended the call and looked out the window at the city below. For years, he had protected this marriage by staying silent. Now he was preparing for the possibility that silence had cost him everything. And upstairs in a private dining room across the city, Victoria leaned closer to Blake Harrison, as he poured another glass of wine, unaware that the man she was slowly replacing had just begun to move. Victoria stopped going home early. At first, she told herself it was temporary. More meetings, more opportunities, more reasons to stay visible. But the truth settled in slowly. Being around Blake Harrison felt easier than being around Graham. Blake never asked her to explain herself. He didn't challenge her perspective, he reinforced it. "You're thinking too small," he told her one night, or as they sat in a private lounge above the city. "You've been conditioned to settle." Victoria swirled her glass, watching the reflection of the skyline ripple in the wine. "I built everything I have from nothing, and you're still thinking like someone who has nothing to lose." That line stayed with her longer than anything else. Meanwhile, Graham noticed the change without needing evidence. It wasn't about where Victoria went, it was about what she no longer brought back. Her conversations disappeared. Eye contact shortened. The house felt quieter, but not peaceful. He didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, he adjusted. He moved important documents out of the house. Not dramatically, not suspiciously, just quietly. Files that had once sat in a locked drawer were transferred to a secure office downtown. Digital access points were changed. Personal accounts separated more clearly from shared ones, not because he wanted distance, because he was preparing for it. One evening, Victoria returned later than usual. The lights in the house were still on. Graham sat in the living room, reading through a set of printed pages. She glanced at them. "Work? Yes, you always have something." Graham looked up. "And you always assume it's nothing." She set her bag down harder than necessary, "Because you never show anything real. What would be real enough for you?" Victoria hesitated, then she said it. "Something I can point to." The words settled between them like a verdict. Graham folded the pages carefully and placed them on the table. They were not business documents. They were legal drafts, structured language, contingency planning. Nothing finalized, but everything precise. He didn't hide them fast enough. Victoria stepped closer and glanced down. Her eyes scanned a few lines. "Asset separation, independent holding," she frowned. "What is this? Preparation? For what?" Graham met her gaze evenly. "For any outcome." Her expression shifted from curiosity to irritation. "So now you're planning for failure instead of fixing anything." "I'm planning responsibly." "That sounds like an excuse." "It's not." Victoria crossed her arms. "You don't even fight for this marriage." Graham stood up slowly. "I've been fighting for it for a long time. Just not the way you wanted." "What does that even mean?" "It means I chose stability over spectacle, and I'm tired of living in something invisible." The argument didn't escalate into shouting. It didn't need to. The distance between them had already done the damage. Victoria turned away first, heading upstairs. Her phone lit up in her hand as she climbed. Graham didn't need to see the name to know who it was. He stayed where he was, letting the silence settle again. That night, Victoria didn't come back downstairs. The next morning, she left early without saying goodbye. Graham waited until the door closed before picking up the pages again. He read through them carefully, making small notes in the margins, adjustments, clarifications, safeguards. This wasn't anger, this was control. Later that afternoon, he met with Thomas Reed in a private office that didn't carry Graham's name anywhere on the lease. Thomas stood as Graham entered. "Everything is in place. Security, confirmed. Timing, aligned with the board's schedule." Graham nodded once. "Good." Thomas hesitated slightly. "Do you expect complications?" Graham considered the question. "Not in business. Not in the acquisition. Those variables were calculated." The complication was personal. "Yes," he said simply. Thomas didn't ask more. He didn't need to. That was the difference between people who worked for Graham and people who lived with him. One group understood that silence often meant precision. The other mistook it for absence. That evening, Victoria sat across from Blake again. This time, the conversation had shifted. "What's stopping you?" Blake asked. "From what?" "Making a change." Victoria looked down at her glass. "It's not that simple." "It never is. But staying where you're undervalued is a decision too." Undervalued, the word hit deeper than it should have. Blake leaned back slightly, watching her. "You deserve a life that reflects your worth." Victoria didn't respond immediately. For the first time, she didn't think about Graham as someone she needed to understand. She thought about him as something she needed to leave behind. That shift mattered. Back at the house, Graham stood in the doorway of their bedroom. He looked at the space they had shared for years. Nothing had changed physically. The same furniture, the same quiet order, but it no longer felt like something they were building together. He walked to the closet and opened it. Victoria's side was fuller than his now. More clothes, more choices, more versions of the life she was trying to step into. Graham reached for a small lockbox on the upper shelf. He opened it carefully. Inside were a few personal items. documents, a sealed envelope. A ring box that had nothing to do with their wedding. He didn't open the envelope. He didn't need to. He already knew what it contained. He closed the box and placed it back exactly where it had been. Then he made a decision. Not emotional, not reactive, final. He picked up his phone and sent a short message. Proceed, no explanation, no details. The reply came within seconds. Understood. Across the city, Victoria's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Blake. It was her father. Robert Collins rarely called this late. She hesitated before answering. "Victoria," he said, his voice tighter than usual. "I need to ask you something. What is it?" "There's a man who came by the office today." Asked about ground. Why? Robert exhaled slowly. Because he didn't talk like someone asking questions. Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. He talked like someone verifying something. A pause. Then Robert added quietly, "And he knew more about your husband than we do. Victoria didn't sleep that night." Robert Collins' voice kept replaying in her head. Not the words themselves, but the tone. Controlled, uneasy, almost cautious. Her father was not a man who sounded uncertain. Not in business, not in family matters, not in anything. Yet he had hesitated. That detail disturbed her more than the question itself. The next morning she drove straight to her parents' house instead of going to work. The neighborhood felt familiar, but something inside her had shifted. The confidence she carried the night before had softened into something less stable. Robert was already waiting in the kitchen when she walked in. Linda Collins stood near the counter, arms folded, watching quietly. Jason Collins leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone but not really looking at it. No one greeted her with warmth. That was new. What did he want? Victoria asked without sitting down. Robert didn't answer immediately. He studied her for a moment, as if recalculating something he had assumed was already clear. "He didn't introduce himself fully," Robert said finally. "But he didn't need to." Victoria frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means he expected to be recognized." Jason let out a short breath. "And when Dad didn't recognize him, the guy didn't get annoyed. He just adjusted." Victoria looked between them. "Adjusted how?" Robert reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward her. Victoria opened it. Inside were printed records, business registration summaries, corporate ownership charts. Nothing too detailed, but enough to raise questions. Her eyes scanned quickly. None of the companies had Graham's name on them, but they kept looping back to something else: private holding structures, layered entities, voting trusts. Her brow tightened. What is this supposed to be? "Connections," Robert said. "To what?" "To your husband." Victoria looked up sharply. "That doesn't make sense." "Exactly," Jason muttered. Robert leaned forward slightly. "The man who came in yesterday didn't ask if Graham was involved in these structures. He asked whether we were aware of our exposure." Victoria blinked. "Exposure to what?" Robert didn't answer right away. "That's the problem," he said quietly. He didn't explain. He assumed we already knew. Silence filled the room. Victoria pushed the folder closed harder than she intended. "This is ridiculous. Graham doesn't even run a company like this." "How do you know?" Jason asked. She turned to him immediately. "Because I've lived with him for years, and you've never asked what he actually does." "That's not true." "It kind of is," Jason said, his tone flat. Victoria looked back at her father. "This is some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe he's consulting for someone. Maybe his name got tied into something bigger." Robert didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. "There's more," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Plain, minimal. No company. Logo. Just a name. Victoria stared at it. "Who is that?" "The man who came to see me and—" Robert's voice dropped slightly. "He didn't ask for a meeting. He informed me he was already late for one." Victoria felt a flicker of irritation. "So what? People talk like that all the time." Robert shook his head slowly. "Not like this." He spoke like time wasn't his problem, like everything else needed to adjust to him. Jason added quietly, "And he called Graham Mr. Sterling like it actually meant something." Victoria let out a breath. "You're all overthinking this." But her voice lacked conviction. Because a part of her had already started connecting things she had ignored before her. The trips. The calls Graham stepped away to take. The way he never explained, but never seemed stressed either. The way he handled money without ever talking about it. The way certain decisions in their life just worked. Too smoothly, too quietly. Victoria stood up suddenly. "I need to talk to him." Robert didn't stop her, but as she reached the door, he said one thing. "Ask him directly." She turned slightly. I will, and listen to the answer this time. That landed harder than she expected. Victoria left without responding. Back at the house, the silence felt heavier than before. Not empty, charged. Graham was already there. He stood in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water like nothing had changed, like everything was still stable. Victoria walked in, her pulse uneven. We need to talk. Graham didn't look surprised. We do. She stepped closer, placing the folder on the counter between them. My father was visited yesterday. Graham's hand paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. By who? He asked calmly. Someone named Thomas Reed. That time, Graham didn't move at all. The silence stretched. Victoria leaned out you. Graham met her eyes. Not defensive. Not evasive. Just measured. What did he ask? Graham said. Victoria felt frustration rise. Don't do that. Don't answer a question with another question. I need to understand what you've been told. You need to tell me what's going on. Another pause. Victoria's voice sharpened. My father thinks there's something you're not telling us. Something big. Graham considered her for a moment. Then he reached for the folder, opened it, and glanced at the documents inside. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look impressed either. He looked familiar with them. That was the first thing that made Victoria's stomach tighten. You've seen this before, she said. Graham closed the folder slowly. Yes, the word hit the room like a crack in glass. Victoria stepped back slightly. So it's real, it's structured, Graham corrected. Structured how? In a way that protects it. Protects what? Graham didn't answer immediately. And that silence said more than anything else. Victoria's voice dropped. Graham, what are you involved in? He looked at her for a long moment, not avoiding, deciding. There are things I manage, he said finally. Quietly. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're ready to hear right now. Her chest tightened. You think I can't handle the truth? I think you never asked for it, that landed. Victoria swallowed. Then I'm asking now. Another pause. Longer this time. Graham set the folder aside. Then you need to decide something first, he said. What? Are you asking because you want to understand me, or because you're afraid of what you might have misunderstood? Victoria froze, because she didn't have an immediate answer. And that was the problem. Her phone vibrated suddenly on the counter. She glanced down, a message from Blake. We need to talk. Something's off. Victoria looked back at Graham, then at the folder, then at her phone. 3 directions. 3 different versions of truth. And for the first time, she wasn't sure which one she could control anymore. Graham watched her quietly, waiting. Not for her to speak, but for her to choose. Her phone vibrated again. This time, a new message appeared. Unknown number. Board meeting confirmed. Chairman approval required within the hour. Victoria's breath caught. She looked up slowly. But Graham was already walking toward the door, without explaining, without stopping, leaving her with the message still glowing in her hand, and a question she could no longer ignore. Who exactly had she been living with all this time? Victoria stood frozen in the kitchen long after the door closed behind Graham. The message still glowed on her phone. Board meeting confirmed. Chairman approval required within the hour. Chairman. Her fingers tightened around the device. That word didn't belong anywhere near Graham, not the man she had lived with. Not the man who drove an old truck and wore the same simple watch every day. And yet it had been sent directly to her phone. Not his, hers, which meant someone, somewhere either made a mistake or assumed she already knew. Victoria grabbed her keys without thinking and rushed out of the house. Her mind was moving faster than her body could keep up. If he was going somewhere important, she needed to see it. Not hear it, not guess. See it. She spotted his truck halfway down the street, already pulling away. She slid into her car and followed at a distance, her pulse loud in her ears. He didn't drive like someone hiding anything. No sudden turns, no hesitation. Just steady. That irritated her more than anything, because people who lie usually slip. Graham didn't. Traffic thickened as they moved closer to downtown. Glass towers began replacing suburban houses. The environment shifted faster, sharper, more controlled. Victoria kept her distance, but her focus never broke. Graham turned into a street she recognized, financial district. That alone made her chest tighten. He didn't belong there, not in the way she understood him. He pulled into a private underground entrance beneath one of the tallest buildings in the city. A sleek barrier gate stood in front, security cameras scanning every angle. Victoria slowed, watching. The gate lifted without hesitation. No card swipe, no delay. Just opened. For him. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. That was not normal. She pulled over across the street, her engine still running. From where she sat, she could see part of the entrance. Moments later, something else happened. Two black SUVs approached from the opposite direction. Not flashy, not loud, but deliberate. They stopped at the same entrance. The gate opened again, no questions asked. Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not coincidence, this was access. She stepped out of her car without fully deciding to. The city noise blurred around her as she walked closer, stopping just far enough to avoid drawing attention. A man in a dark suit stood near the entrance, speaking quietly into an earpiece. Professional, controlled. Not security for a random office building. Something else. The man's gaze swept the area briefly. For a split second, it landed on her. Victoria instinctively stepped back. He didn't approach, didn't question, but the message was clear. This space was not hers. She turned away, forcing herself to breathe. This didn't prove anything. It just meant Graham had access. Connections, maybe clients, maybe. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. Delay unacceptable. Chairman arrival confirmed, proceeding to final vote window. Her heartbeat skipped. Final vote. What vote? Victoria turned back toward the building. Then she saw something she hadn't expected. Blake Harrison. He stepped out of a rideshare across the street, adjusting his jacket, his expression confident as always. He hadn't seen her yet. Victoria watched him carefully. Blake didn't walk toward the main entrance. He headed toward a side lobby. Different access point. Lower level. He checked his reflection in the glass before stepping inside. That detail hit her immediately. Blake cared about how he looked before entering. Graham hadn't. Graham walked in like he belonged. The contrast was sharp, and it unsettled her more than anything else that morning. Victoria followed Blake at a distance, slipping into the same lobby before the door closed completely. The interior was polished but quieter than the main entrance. Fewer people, more controlled movement. Blake approached the reception desk with practiced ease. "I'm here for the acquisition meeting," he said, voice smooth. Blake Harrison. The receptionist typed quickly, then paused. "I'm sorry, sir," she said politely. "You're not on the approved access list for the executive floor." Blake blinked, clearly caught off guard. "That's not possible. I've been coordinating with." She cut him off gently. "You may wait in the designated conference lounge. You'll be contacted if clearance changes." Blake's jaw tightened slightly, but he forced a smile. Of course, Victoria watched the entire exchange from a few steps behind. Something clicked. Blake had been acting like he was part of something bigger, but he wasn't. Not fully. Not at this level. And that's when he saw her. His expression shifted instantly. "Victoria," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer right away. She studied him. "You said something was off," she said finally. "What did you mean?" Blake hesitated. For the first time since she met him, he didn't have a smooth answer ready. "There's a deal happening," he said carefully. "A big one. I thought I was closer to it than I actually am." "How big?" Blake exhaled slowly. "Bigger than anything I've worked on." "And Graham?" Blake frowned. "What about him? He's here." Blake let out a short laugh. "That's not possible." I followed him. The laughter stopped. Blake's eyes searched hers, looking for doubt. "There wasn't any. That doesn't mean anything," he said. But his voice lacked certainty now. Victoria leaned in slightly. The gate opened for him. No security check, no delay. Blake's expression changed, subtle, but real. "That doesn't make sense," he said quietly. "No," Victoria replied. "It doesn't." Silence stretched between them. Then something shifted behind the glass elevator doors across the lobby. The doors opened. A group of executives stepped out. Sharp suits, a controlled movement. At the center of them stood a familiar figure, Graham. He walked forward calmly, speaking to a woman beside him. Older, composed, Margaret Lawson. Victoria didn't know her name, but Blake did. His entire posture changed. He straightened instantly, eyes locking onto the scene. "That's," he whispered. Victoria turned to him. "What?" Blake didn't answer immediately. Because Graham didn't stop walking, he didn't acknowledge the lobby, he didn't hesitate. He moved like someone who had already made the final decision. Margaret spoke to him quietly, and then she nodded. Not casually, respectfully. Blake's voice dropped even lower. That's the senior board chair. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. Graham reached the private elevator. The doors opened without a button being pressed. He stepped inside. The executives followed. Margaret stepped in last. Before the doors closed, she turned slightly toward Graham and said one word, "Chairman." The elevator doors slid shut, and this time there was no doubt left to hide behind. Victoria stood there, her world shifting under her feet, but Blake spoke again, barely above a whisper. "If he's the chairman," he looked at her, then back at the elevator, "then we've both been playing the wrong game." And for the first time, Victoria realized the truth wasn't just hidden. It had been right in front of her. She just never looked close enough. Victoria didn't remember leaving the building. One moment she was standing in that quiet lobby, watching the elevator doors close on Graham. The next, she was outside, the noise of the city rushing back into her ears like something she had forgotten existed. Blake followed her out, but he didn't speak right away. For once, he didn't have anything to say. That alone told her everything. "You knew," Victoria said finally, her voice low but sharp. Blake stopped beside her. "No," he said quickly. "I didn't know. You recognize that woman." His jaw tightened. "Everyone in the industry knows Margaret Lawson, and you still didn't connect her to him?" Blake hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Victoria let out a short breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. "You've been standing next to me this whole time, acting like you understood the game." "I do understand the game," Blake snapped, but there was strain in his voice now. "Just not that version of it." Victoria turned to him fully. "Then explain it." Blake ran a hand through his hair, his composure cracking for the first time since she had met him. "If he's really the chairman, if that wasn't just a title they throw around." "It wasn't," Victoria said quietly. Blake looked back at the building. "Then that means the acquisition happening in there right now, it doesn't move without his approval." Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. "How big is it?" she asked. Blake gave a short, humorless laugh. "Big enough that people like me try to get close to it for years and still never make it into that room." Silence fell between them again. Victoria glanced down at her phone. The message was still there. Chairman approval required. She swallowed all those years, all those assumptions, and she had never once asked the right question. Blake's voice broke into her thoughts. "You need to talk to him." Victoria shook her head slowly. "I just tried." "No," Blake said. "You ask questions. That's not the same thing." She looked at him sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means you've been talking at him, not to him." That hit harder than she expected. Victoria looked away, her mind replaying every conversation she had dismissed. Every time Graham had tried to explain something in his own quiet way, and she had brushed it off because it didn't sound impressive enough. Blake exhaled slowly. "Look, whatever this is, it's not small. And if he's been hiding it this long, there's a reason. Do you?" Blake challenged softly. Victoria didn't answer, because she wasn't sure anymore. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't an unknown number. "It was her father," she answered immediately. "Victoria, Robert Collins said, his voice tight. Turn on the financial news. Now." Her stomach dropped. "Why? Just do it." The call ended. Victoria opened a live stream without thinking. A financial network was already broadcasting breaking coverage. A headline ran across the screen. "Major acquisition underway. Final vote pending." A reporter stood outside the same building she had just left, speaking quickly, urgently. "This deal, if approved, will shift control of multiple infrastructure and technology assets across international markets. Sources confirm the final decision rests with a single controlling authority." Victoria's breath caught. The reporter continued. "A chairman whose identity has been largely kept out of public view due to private ownership structures and layered investment vehicles." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she raised the volume. "They don't even show his face," Blake murmured beside her. The screen cut to analysts discussing potential outcomes, speculating on influence, on strategy, on power. Not one of them mentioned Graham by name, but everything they said pointed to him. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. Blake let out a quiet breath. "That's not just wealth," he said. "That's control." Victoria nodded faintly, because now she understood something deeper. It wasn't just that Graham had money. It was that decisions at that level waited for him. She thought about the way he stood in their kitchen earlier. Calm, measured, unrushed. Not because he had nothing to lose, but because he knew exactly what he held. Her chest tightened again, But this time it wasn't confusion, it was regret, and it came fast. Blake glanced at her. You didn't know. Victoria let out a quiet, hollow laugh. That's the problem. I didn't want to know. Blake didn't respond, because there was nothing to say to that. Victoria turned back toward the building. I'm going back in. Blake shook his head immediately. You can't watch me. They won't let you past the lobby. Victoria's eyes hardened slightly. Then I'll wait. For what? For him to come out. Blake studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then I'll stay. Victoria didn't argue. They returned to the building, but this time she didn't try to follow him inside. She stayed across the street, watching the entrance. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something you didn't understand. Minutes stretched. Cars came and went. Executives entered and exited through different access points. Victoria didn't move. Blake checked his phone repeatedly but said nothing. Then, after what felt like hours, the underground gate opened again. The same black SUVs emerged, one after another, not rushed, not delayed, controlled. Victoria's pulse spiked. The lead vehicle stopped near the entrance. A man stepped out. Thomas Reed. He scanned the street briefly, his expression unreadable. Then he opened the rear door and stepped aside. Graham stepped out. Same clothes, same calm posture. But everything about him felt different now. Not because he had changed, because she had. Victoria crossed the street without thinking. Blake called her name, but she didn't stop. She reached the sidewalk just as Graham turned toward the entrance. Graham, he paused, slowly, then turned to face her. No surprise, no irritation, just acknowledgement. Victoria stood there, breath uneven, words stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. For the first time since she met him, she didn't know how to speak to him. I saw, she said finally. Graham didn't ask what she meant, because he already knew. The meeting, she continued. The chairman. Silence stretched between them. Victoria took a step closer. Why didn't you tell me? Graham looked at her for a long moment, then he said quietly, I tried. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Victoria felt it hit, all at once. Every dismissed conversation, every ignored detail. Her voice softened. Then tell me now. Graham studied her again, not testing, not judging, just deciding. Before he could answer, Thomas Reed stepped forward slightly. Sir, he said calmly, the board is waiting for confirmation. The moment broke, not loudly, but completely. Victoria turned toward the man, then back to Graham, her eyes widened slightly. Bored, waiting again. The same words, the same urgency. And she understood something clearly now. This wasn't about explaining himself to her. This was about decisions that affected far more than their marriage. Graham looked at her one last time. I'll come back tonight, he said. Not a promise, not a negotiation, a statement. Victoria nodded slowly. Because for the first time she wasn't the center of his world, and she had no idea where she stood in it anymore. Graham stepped into the SUV. The door closed, the convoy pulled away, leaving Victoria standing there, finally aware of the truth, but far too late to control it. Victoria didn't follow the convoy. She stood there, long after the last SUV disappeared into traffic, her body still, but her thoughts racing in every direction at once. Blake stayed beside her for a moment, then slowly stepped back. I should go, he said quietly. Victoria didn't respond. He waited, maybe expecting something, an answer, a reaction, anything. But she gave him nothing. Because for the first time, Blake Harrison didn't feel like the center of her decisions anymore. He wasn't even part of the real equation. When he finally walked away, Victoria barely noticed. She turned and got into her car. The drive back to the house felt longer than usual. Not because of traffic, but because everything she thought she understood about her life had shifted. Graham had said he would come back tonight. That meant she had time. Time to think. Time to prepare. Time to decide what she was going to say when he walked through that door, and for once she didn't want to get it wrong. When she reached the house, it felt unfamiliar. Not physically, emotionally. She walked inside slowly, her eyes scanning the space as if she were seeing it for the first time. The couch where they had spent quiet evenings, the kitchen where he stood that morning, or the hallway where she had walked past him countless times without really looking. She moved toward the bedroom and opened the closet. His side was almost empty. Not completely, just selective. The things he left behind weren't random. They were deliberate. Simple clothes, everyday items, nothing that hinted at anything more. Victoria stepped closer, running her fingers along the hangers. No expensive suits, no hidden symbols. Nothing that would have told her the truth earlier. He had lived exactly the way she believed he did. And that realization hit differently, because it meant he hadn't been pretending. He had just been choosing what to show. Her gaze shifted to the nightstand, a small drawer she rarely opened. She hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside were a few documents, neatly arranged, nothing dramatic, just organized. Victoria picked up the top folder. Inside were printed pages, contracts, agreements. She didn't understand most of the language at first glance, but certain words stood out. Voting rights, controlling interest, confidential governance. Her breath slowed. This wasn't something a consultant carried around casually. She flipped through more pages. Everything was partial, nothing complete, as if it was never meant to explain everything. Just enough to exist. Her fingers paused on one page, a signature line. G. Sterling, clean, confident, recognizable. Victoria stared at it for a long moment. That signature wasn't something new. She had seen it before, on checks, on small paperwork, on everyday things, but here it looked different. Not because it changed, or because the meaning behind it had. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Linda Collins. Victoria answered. Victoria. Her mother's voice came through, softer than usual. Your father just got another call. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. From who? The same man, Thomas Reed. Her grip tightened on the folder. What did he say? Linda hesitated. He said the deal went through. Victoria's breath caught. It's already done, she asked. Yes, Linda replied. And he said, your father should be aware that any previous assumptions about exposure are no longer theoretical. Victoria frowned. It means, Linda said carefully, your father is now trying to understand how much influence Graham actually has, and whether any of our business overlaps with it. Victoria felt a chill run through her, because that wasn't about curiosity, that was about risk. Her mother continued, your father wants to meet him. Victoria let out a quiet breath. Of course he does, but not the way he would have before, Linda added. That part didn't need explanation. Victoria understood. Respect had replaced dismissal, fear had replaced certainty. She hung up slowly. The room felt quieter than before, heavier. She looked down at the documents again, then back at the house around her. All those years she had believed she was carrying the weight of the relationship, that she was the one sacrificing, that she was the one settling. But now she wasn't sure she had ever really seen what she was standing next to. A soft sound broke her thoughts, the front door. Victoria's heart jumped. She stepped out of the bedroom slowly, moving down the hallway. The door opened. Graham stepped inside. No rush, no announcement, just presence. He closed the door behind him and looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt different now, not just emotional, structural, like two people standing on completely different levels of understanding. Victoria held the folder in her hands. You left these, she said quietly. Graham glanced at it briefly. I know, you didn't take them with you. No. Why? He met her eyes. Because I wasn't hiding everything. That answer settled into the room. Victoria stepped closer. Then why didn't you show me this? Graham didn't move. Because showing something doesn't mean it's understood. Her chest tightened. I would have tried, she said. You didn't try when it was smaller, he replied calmly. Why would you try when it became bigger? That wasn't said with anger. That made it worse. Victoria swallowed. I saw the meeting. He nodded once. And Blake was there, she added. That made him pause. Only slightly, but she caught it. He wasn't in the room, she continued. He couldn't even get access. Graham's expression didn't change. But something in his silence confirmed it. Victoria took another step forward. What is he to you? Graham held her gaze. Someone who thinks he understands power, he said, but only understands access. The difference hit her immediately. Victoria's voice softened. And me? That question lingered. Graham didn't answer right away. He looked at her. Really looked. Not as the woman who stood beside him for years, but as someone he was now deciding whether he still recognized. Before he could speak, his phone vibrated. He glanced at it briefly. Then his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. What is it? Victoria asked slowly. The board wants a follow-up session, he said. Now? No, he replied. Tonight. Victoria's breath caught, because that meant something else. He wasn't done. This wasn't finished. Whatever he had approved earlier, there were consequences still unfolding. She tightened her grip on the folder. And you have to go? Graham looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "I always had to go." The words landed deeper than anything else he had said, because they weren't about tonight, they were about everything. Victoria stood there, the weight of it pressing in, finally understanding something she had never asked before. Not what he did, but what it cost him to do it, and whether she had ever been part of that world, or just someone watching it from the outside. Graham turned slightly, setting his keys on the counter, then looked back at her. "We should talk," he said. "Not later, not tomorrow now." Victoria nodded slowly, because this conversation would decide everything, and she had no idea if she was ready for the truth he had held back all this time. Victoria didn't move. Not when Graham said they should talk. Not when the silence stretched between them, heavier than anything that had been said so far. She stood there, holding the folder like it was the only thing grounding her while he waited. He wasn't forcing the moment. That was what made it harder. Graham had never forced anything. Not attention, not respect, not even honesty. And now, standing across from him, Victoria realized that everything she had demanded from him over the years, proof, status, ambition, he had never argued against. He had simply chosen not to perform. She stepped forward slowly and set the folder on the table between them. "I didn't know how to ask the right questions," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried something new, not defensiveness. Recognition. Graham didn't respond right away. He looked at the folder, then back at her. "You didn't ask any questions," he said. Again, no anger. "Just truth," Victoria exhaled. "Because I thought I already had the answers." That landed. It stayed there between them. He walked past her toward the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, like the conversation wasn't something he needed to rush. Like he had time. Like he had always had time. Victoria watched him. Even now, nothing about him looked different. Same calm posture, same quiet presence, no sign of the scale she had just begun to understand. "You were leaving," she said suddenly. Graham paused, glass in hand. "Yes. Not just today," she added, before this. He didn't deny it. Victoria swallowed. "When? A while ago. How long?" He took a sip of water before answering, long enough to know it wouldn't fix itself. That answer hit deeper than anything else so far, because it meant he hadn't been blindsided. He had been preparing, quietly, while she had been complaining, comparing, drifting further away. Victoria's voice lowered. "Why didn't you say anything?" Graham set the glass down. "I did." She frowned. "No, you didn't. I just didn't say it in a way you were willing to hear." That stung, because she knew exactly what he meant. The small moments she had dismissed. The times he had tried to talk about values instead of outcomes. The times she had interrupted him with something more urgent, more visible, more impressive. Victoria looked down briefly, then back at him. "Was I ever part of that world?" she asked. The question came out softer than she expected, not accusatory, just honest. Graham studied her for a moment. "You were always part of my life," he said. "That's not the same thing," she replied. He didn't argue. Because she was right. The silence stretched again. This time it wasn't uncomfortable, it was necessary. Victoria took a breath. "Blake thinks he understands what you do." Graham let out a quiet, almost amused breath. "Blake understands how to be seen. And you?" she asked. "I understand how to not be." That difference settled in her mind. Clear, sharp. Victoria moved closer, her voice more certain now. "He was trying to position himself in that meeting," she said. "I could see it. He wanted to look like he belonged there." Graham nodded slightly. "That's his business. And mine?" she asked. He met her eyes again. "That depends on what you choose next." There it was. Not judgment, not accusation. A line, a boundary. For the first time, Victoria realized he wasn't waiting for her to prove anything. He was waiting to see if she would take responsibility for something. Anything. She looked down at the folder again, then pushed it slightly toward him. "I'm not asking for explanations anymore," she said. Graham's expression didn't change. "But I am asking for clarity," she added. He waited. Victoria held his gaze. "Are we already over?" The question hung there, heavy, honest. And for the first time, she didn't try to control the answer. Graham didn't respond immediately. He walked back to the table, placing his hand lightly on the folder, but not opening it. "When you threw me out this afternoon," he said quietly, "that wasn't just anger." Victoria's throat tightened. It was a decision. She didn't argue, because she knew, Graham continued, and decisions have consequences. "I know," she said. But this time it didn't sound like defiance, it sounded like acceptance. He looked at her carefully. Asking if it's over now, he said, is different from asking if it can be fixed. Victoria felt that distinction immediately. One was final, or the other required effort and humility. She took a slow breath. Then, let me ask it the right way. He waited. Victoria's voice softened, but didn't break. Is there anything left to fix? That question changed everything, because it didn't demand. It offered. Graham studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt every second, long enough that she didn't look away. Finally, he said, I don't know. It wasn't rejection. But it wasn't hope either. It was honest. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. Victoria nodded slowly. I understand. She didn't cry, didn't collapse, didn't try to bargain. For the first time in a long time, she just stood there, present, accountable, and that alone shifted something. Graham saw it, but he didn't comment. Because change wasn't something you declared, it was something you proved. A sharp vibration broke the moment, his phone again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He checked it. Then his expression hardened slightly. What is it? Victoria asked. Graham looked up. The board moved the session forward, he said, to when an hour. Victoria's chest tightened. That wasn't routine. That meant urgency. That meant whatever he had approved earlier was already creating pressure. Do you have to go now? She asked. Yes, of course he did. He picked up his keys again, but this time, before he turned away, he paused. Just for a second, then looked back at her. You should decide what you want this to be, he said. Not a command, not nodded slowly. I will. He held her gaze for one more moment, then walked past her. The door opened, closed, and he was gone again. Victoria stood alone in the house. But it didn't feel the same as before, because now she wasn't waiting. She was thinking, reevaluating. For the first time, not in comparison to anyone else, not through Blake, not through her family, just herself. Her eyes moved back to the folder on the table. Then to her phone, she picked it up, scrolled through her contacts, and paused on a name she had never thought to call before. Margaret Lawson. Her finger hovered for a moment, then pressed. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. This is Margaret Lawson. Victoria took a breath. My name is Victoria Collins, she said. I believe you know my husband. There was a brief pause. Not confusion, recognition. Yes, Margaret replied. Victoria's grip tightened slightly. I need to understand something, she said. Another pause, measured, professional. What exactly do you want to understand, Mrs. Collins? Margaret asked. Victoria didn't hesitate this time. Everything he chose not to tell me. The silence on the other end stretched longer. Then Margaret spoke again. Then I suggest you come to the meeting tonight. Victoria's heart skipped. That's not something I can just. You can, Margaret interrupted gently. If you're ready to see the truth. Victoria's breath slowed. Because this wasn't just about information anymore. It was about stepping into a world she had spent years ignoring. Where? She asked quietly. Margaret gave her the address. A downtown building. One she had passed before without thinking twice. The call ended. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. Her reflection in the dark screen stared back at her. For the first time, she didn't see certainty. She saw a choice. And she knew walking into that building tonight wouldn't just show her who Graham really was. It would show her who she had been all along, and whether she was ready to face it. 3 years later, the ballroom was filled with quiet influence. Not the kind that needed to be announced. The kind that was recognized in small nods, measured conversations, and the subtle way people adjusted their tone when someone important entered the room. Victoria Collins stood near the center of it, speaking with a group of donors about a housing initiative she had helped rebuild from the ground up. Her voice was steady, clear, no longer shaped by comparison or the need to impress. She had spent the last few years building something of her own. Not to match anyone else, but to understand what it meant to create value without chasing validation. People listened to her now, not because of who she was connected to, but because of what she had done. Across the room, a shift in attention moved quietly through the crowd. Graham Sterling had arrived. No convoy this time, no distance. He walked in with the same calm presence he had always carried, but there was no effort to hide it anymore. People greeted him with respect that didn't need explanation. Conversations paused just slightly as he passed. He didn't seek the attention. He simply no longer avoided it. Victoria noticed him before he saw her. For a moment she just watched. Not the billionaire husband she had once failed to understand, but the man she had lived beside, and never truly seen. When their eyes finally met, there was no tension, no unfinished argument waiting to surface. Just recognition. Graham approached her without hesitation. "Victoria," he said. His voice was the same. It always had been, Graham. They stood there for a moment, neither rushing to fill the space. "You've built something meaningful," he said, glancing toward the presentation behind her. She nodded. "It took longer than I expected." "It usually does," he replied. There was no edge in his voice. No reminder of the past, just acknowledgement. Victoria studied him carefully. "You don't hide it anymore." Graham understood what she meant. "No," he said, "not anymore." "Why now?" He paused briefly. "Because I stopped needing to prove that someone could love me without it." That answer stayed with her, not as regret, but as clarity. Victoria let out a quiet breath. "I thought money was the problem back then." Graham shook his head slightly. "It never was." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "No, it was how I saw it. There was no need to say more." They both understood what had been lost and why. Victoria glanced around the room, then back at him. "I used to think success looked like this." She gestured lightly to the event, and now, he asked. She took a moment before answering. "Now I think it's quieter than I expected." Graham gave a small nod. That's usually where it lasts. The conversation softened after that. No apologies repeated, no attempts to reopen what had already been closed. They had both changed. Not into people who could return to what they were, but into people who finally understood what had been missing. Victoria didn't ask to try again, and Graham didn't offer, because some things, once broken by misunderstanding, were not meant to be rebuilt. But they didn't leave resentment behind either, just perspective. As the evening moved on, they spoke a little longer, about work, about the years that had passed, about the choices that had shaped them, and then, naturally, the moment ended. "I'm glad you're doing well," Victoria said. Graham held her gaze. "You too, no hesitation, no doubt, just truth." He stepped back first, giving her space the same way he always had. Only now she recognized it for what it was. Respect. Victoria watched him walk away, not with the ache she once would have felt, but with something steadier. Acceptance. She hadn't lost a rich husband. She had lost a man whose strength had never depended on wealth. And that was something she had once been too blind to value. Now she understood. Not in a way that brought him back, but in a way that allowed her to move forward without repeating the same mistake. The night continued. Conversations resumed, and both of them returned to their separate paths, no longer defined by what they had been to each other, but by what they had learned and what they had chosen to become after. If this story reminded you that true character is revealed long before wealth is, share your thoughts below, and remember, the quietest people often carry the greatest strength.